Well, we are at our time, so we'll get started. A few folks may trickle in yet, but good morning. Good to see all of you on this final day already of our Symposium 2023. It's been a great few days, and we're anticipating another great day today. I'm Scott Hoezee, and I'm director of the Center for Excellence in Preaching here at Calvin Seminary, and that's a partner institute with the Worship Institute and John Whitfleet and Company, and a co-sponsor of this symposium every year. So good to welcome all of you here. I'm just going to ask each of I think you know who these people are, but just ask each of you to introduce yourself. Just remind us where you are serving and what you're doing right now. So just start with Laura and go on down the line.
I'm Laura Jong, and I am the pastor of preaching and pastoral care at Community Christian Reformed Church in Kitchener, Ontario.
I'm Najla Kasab. I live in Beirut. I'm president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. I work in the Christian education between Lebanon and Syria.
Hello, Marshall Hatch and New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago. Been pastor there since 1993, and also professor of ministry at Northern Seminary in Lisle, Illinois.
And Danny Román-Gloró, I'm director of the Asbury Latino Center at Asbury Theological Seminary.
Good to have all of you here. Three of us are done with our preaching duty for the week. Two of us are coming up, and they don't want to give too much. Laura and Danny don't want to give too much away, but they'll maybe tease their sermon a little bit. We, at the Worship Institute, we didn't used to, so we've been doing this symposium for 30 years or so, but probably starting about 15 years ago, we decided to do something we had never done before, and that was that we had all the worship service, of the five, or we used to have six, main worship services would all be from the same book. We didn't used to do that. We used to just sort of let preachers choose whatever they wanted. Some of you would probably envy that right about now for the text I gave you. But we did decide to do that. We've done Exodus, we've done Psalms, we did Philippians, Hebrews. But this year, when we were trying to think of something, we were thinking, I don't know, even remember how we settled on Colossians, but we knew that there was some good writing, including from Marianne May Thompson, who's got a good commentary out on Colossians. And it seemed to us, just in general ways, that it was a timely book for our moment. And I think the preaching this week so far has shown that. But I just want to have each of you reflect a little bit, and we'll start with Danny and then go down, and I'll go last, of maybe the connections you found between your particular text, and each of you remind us of what your text is or was or will be. But the connections you saw between your context of the world today and what you found in Colossians. So Danny, we'll have you go first, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure, so I'll be preaching this afternoon from Colossians 3, 1 through 11, which starts with a great so, and bigger than life. So I think that one of the challenges that I saw in the text is this laundry list of do's and don'ts, and how those do's and don'ts are just so similar to how we're living as a culture nowadays and what's going on in our culture. And it's interesting because when you read Colossians, you think it's kind of a harmonious group, but it's interesting that in verse 11, Paul starts talking about, as you do this new life, don't think of divisions, don't think of differences, don't focus on the fact that some are Jews, some are Gentiles, some are this, some are that, and so it got me thinking a lot about divisions and how divided we truly are, no matter where, especially in the U.S. And I was talking to Laura this morning about there's an international crowd here, so how do you communicate this without being specific, without necessarily alienating everybody? But I think we live in a world that is very polarized, and I think that Colossians has something to say to that.
Thank you, Danny. Marshall Hatch again. I had Colossians chapter 2, 6 through 15 Rooted in Christ was the theme. And it was, I found it interesting to sort of approach it from my own sort of cultural and historical context. I do some teaching on contextual theology. So that how does Colossians hit, for example, the people who have the experience in America of being the enslaved and a part of a caste that still has a lot of challenges, and challenges with the way that Christianity can be used to marginalize people. So that challenge of approaching Colossians in particular was, I thought, very, very interesting. Of course, the in him all of the fullness of deity dwells fully. That whole inspiration of God being incarnated, and particularly with the marginalized, is where I found a place to talk about the affinity of the oppressed and the disempowered for identifying with Jesus before resurrection. Literally, fellowship with the suffering of Jesus. So that was something I found just very inspiring. And then obviously in light of the James Webb telescope piece, just the wonder of the God of all of creation whose power is displayed, being also empathetic to people who are on the margins in this little speck of dust in the universe, and identifying with us, the deity literally being embodied and being with the marginalized is always wondrous to me.
I preached from Colossians 1:15-23, Christ in all things. And this text has been with me for the last 4 months. And I always said, why did Scott gave this text for me? Because it's first part of this text speaks about who God is in God's self. And these are questions that young people don't ask as much. It's who is Christ for me. So what I did when I first started preaching this text, I called my boy who's 17 years old. And I said, read this text. What is it that you find interesting? He read it and he said, the image of a visible God. And then I started to prepare from there and wrote my sermon. On the way, an earthquake happens. My sermon was changed. Although I have done the exegetical work, and it was connected to what's the issue there? What's the issue that Paul was writing to? When I went into the Greek life, I discovered the fear that is found in that community about God. And the fear that if you disturb God, God will disturb the whole city. So fear was, before coming here, fear was a key part in the context of that community. And on the way, with the fear that happened in the earthquake, spoke to me, this text. And this is why I focused on two issues related to you are reconciled, and I focused about shifting of the hope, because of this is our context, and especially with the context of the pandemic. We're coming back, churches have less people, so this text, the key part was fear. Fear in the Middle East, fear now, fear for the pastors, about the future of the congregations. And then through this, when we discover the closeness of God, then we could say He is the image, He is the one. So the question is, who is to me is central in our preaching today. Because the church doesn't, and this is liberation theology, the church doesn't ask who God is in himself anymore, as much. It's who is to me, and I think I thought the second part about who is to them and the confusion that they were in. I liked most the attitude of, being in the light but thinking in the dark. They were confused community, and we are confused community. We are. I mean, COVID confused us about how to start in this. So yes, I want to thank you now, Scott, for choosing that text. But I tell you, it's a difficult text. It was a difficult text for me. But it is finding this key for the text that spoke to my context back home and to the church here.
I have Colossians 3:12-17. So my section starts with the therefore right after Danny's section. His starts with the so, mine is the therefore. And it's really the now that you have heard all of this, here is how you are called to live and to dwell. And so this is the clothe yourselves with kindness, patience, humility, gentleness, and above all of these things, put on love. And I don't know about you, but all of the people that I interact with on a daily basis are regularly clothed in kindness, gentleness, patience, humility, and love. This is a very relevant text, right? I think especially in a time when there's a lot of anxiety in church, of coming out of COVID, polarization, young people leaving, right? Like there's just anxiety, and anxiety tends to turn us inward. And so that call then to clothe ourselves, to turn away from this earthly nature, right? To turn away from that inward fear, all of the things that come out of that posture, and instead have a posture of openness to each other. The other thing in this passage that I'm not going to preach on a lot, I'll mention it, but it's been sitting with me this whole conference, is this line towards the end. It's verse 16, teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts. Some translations separate that, teach and admonish and sing. The Greek is pretty ambivalent about it, and so other translations also, they merge that, right? This idea that we teach and admonish one another by singing together, by worshiping together. And I've been thinking, there have been lots of conversations this week about online worship, live streaming. What does it mean to be together, to be the body? And I'm thinking through, like, what have we lost, right? When we're not singing together, when we're not worshiping together, what happens in that space that is really important to name and hold on to? So that's what I've been thinking about. Oh, you have one.
I'll share it though later. I also wondered why I gave myself the text I gave myself, if it makes you feel any better. Because it was, it's just the opening. I mean, it's the opening of the letter. My first word is Paul. Yeah. Oh, that's real exciting. I'll take a therefore any day. At least there was some context. Paul and Timothy. So it was the opening, and for me, the sermon came together kind of slowly. I mean, once I sort of, you all know, probably all of you are preachers. How many of you who are preachers or preach fairly regularly? Yeah, but almost everybody, right? So you know that, on a good week anyway, you hit that angle, and you just need the one thing per sermon, right? And once I found that, then I figured out what my closing story would be, that story about Miguel Velez that I told at the end of my sermon on Wednesday afternoon. Then it kind of came together. But because it's the opening, and Paul did often used his openings to preview. It's sort of like the table of contents of what's coming up. So I realized I took the risk of, taking all of your material a little bit. But it's going to be some advantage to going first. You don't have to worry that you're repeating anybody. But it did strike me as I thought about those words, and I directly mentioned this in my sermon Wednesday, that years ago at a conference that we used to have here, kind of a pre-symposium, back in the 80s and 90s, there was something called the Ministers Institute. It was mostly a Christian Reformed in-house thing. But we had Tom Long here, who was at the time teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary, preaching. He later went on to Candler Divinity School at Emory and took Fred Craddock's chair there. But he preached on 1 Corinthians and preached on it in such a way that I'd never seen before, but then once you sort of see it, it just seems absolutely right, that Paul's being ironic. He's praising the Corinthians. So we believe Paul got a letter right from the Corinthians with a long list of questions, issues, squabbles. And Paul's kind of ticking through that. He ticks through that through the whole letter, as you all know, all the way to the end about the resurrection, and then starting with the folly of the cross, and then eventually getting to spiritual gifts and all that. But he's kind of ticking through their laundry list, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, he is praising God for them, he really is, but he's jostling in the ribs a little bit too. You've got every spiritual gift, don't you? You know what I'm talking about. So I thought, well, some of that may be going on here. So that sort of gave a way in to sort of say, Paul knows what's going on in Colossae. He's gotten the report. It's not his church. He didn't found it, but he knows what's going on. So he's going to jostle these folks in the ribs just a little bit to sort of name what is going to be coming up in the letter. And it did strike me that the context of Colossae there did have a lot to do with today. And I mentioned this. We, here at Calvin Seminary, we were invited last year to apply for a grant with Lilly Endowment in what they're calling the Compelling Preaching Initiative. Neil Plantinga talked about that a little bit in the session he and Laura did Wednesday. And we got that grant, and they had a phase one to plan for the grant. And they supplied us with some funds to do grant planning. And the main thing we did with that was that I went around the country last summer. So I went to the San Francisco area, I went to Portland, Oregon, Sioux Center, Iowa, the Silver Spring, Baltimore, Maryland area, and Denver, Colorado, and had an ecumenical group of pastors that I met with for a couple hours in each place to talk about what's going on in the church today. What's it like to preach today? Because we wanted our main grant proposal to Lilly to be a program that'll address what folks need. And that was so revealing. And once I sort of started to bring what I learned on that listening tour into conversation with Colossians 1 and with the whole letter to the Colossians, then a lot of stuff really clicked, that indeed we're confused, we're fearful, we're looking for something else, something more. Pastors are feeling a lot of pressure, particularly in what Laura just mentioned, the hybrid worship environment, and how that has changed preaching or has added to the list of things preachers worry about. We've all got things we worry about as preachers. We just added a few more, recognizing the online platform that a lot of us are being watched on now. So once some of that came together, it was one of those things that, I always tell our preaching students here at Calvin Seminary, and we use Paul Scott Wilson's 4 pages of the sermon as kind of a template. You got to start somewhere. You only have time really to teach one possible way to make a sermon, and that's what we do. We do 4 pages. But if you know Paul Wilson, then you know that page 1 is trouble in the text, and page 2 is trouble in the world. What's going on in the text? What's up in the air? What's the issue, question, crisis, doubt? And then page 2, trouble in the world, where is that today? And one of the things I have always said to our students is, there is no trouble in the Bible. There is no question, crisis, tension, doubt in the Bible that does not still exist today. You shouldn't have to work ever too terribly hard to build that bridge, at least on the trouble side. The exact grace that gets applied can be maybe a different challenge, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so, Abraham and Sarah's questions are also our questions. And some of the Colossian problem was also our problem. So that was sort of a little bit how that came together, and I recognized, and it's been borne out in Najla's and Marshall's sermon so far, and I'm sure it'll continue with Danny and Laura, that indeed we're all kind of hitting on some similar themes, and that's okay, right? I think it's the Holy Spirit telling us what we need to hear by working in each of us in slightly different ways, and yet we're coming out in some very similar places. So I'm very grateful for that. We'll start with Laura and then go down the line. This is somewhat similar to the other question, but hopefully you can tease it out a little bit. Think of a congregation. Now, a couple of you at least are pastoring a congregation. All of us are part of a home congregation at least. But think of your congregation, the one you pastor, or one you have pastored, or one that you attend as a worshiper. Anything about your particular congregation that something in Colossians, in your text, or just in the wider epistle, because I'm sure we all read through the whole epistle in preparation, that hit you is particularly relevant for your congregation?
Yeah, I just quoted my text in a bulletin announcement to the congregation, inviting them to dwell in love and gentleness in the midst of a pretty fraught time for our congregation specifically. Our denomination is having hard conversations about human sexuality, and so our congregation is having hard conversations about that. And there are differences of opinion, and we're trying to steward those conversations well, and to do so in a way that feels like there is unity here still, right? That reminds people what it means to be the church, and that we are the church together. And again, that's creating deep anxiety, I think, in my congregation. And out of that, it's really easy to lash out at people or to write your own narrative about what's going on. So in that sense, right, the call to unity, the call to put on these things, to practice love and hospitality and compassion feels really relevant right now. We're part of that conversation, and part of, I think, a broader conversation culturally, right, is what is truth, right, and who gets to say what that is, and what happens when we disagree on what truth is. And I think what's happening in Colossians too, particularly, is people are arguing about what is true, right? What does the gospel look like? What is important? What do we need to do? And so this, Colossians is, it's this foundation, right? It is Jesus Christ. Be rooted in Christ. Be rooted in the good news of Jesus Christ. We can never preach that too much, I think, right now. It's just that foundation piece that everything else comes from.
To me, I don't have a congregation, but I work with all the pastors in Lebanon and Syria. And the challenge that I see about hope after COVID is a key challenge, shifting from the hope. You feel like people are discouraged, they don't know how to come again, to start again, to be centered around hope. This is why I use 3 stories, and I'm Tom Long's student. The first story, which is critical, about whether you put worship or you use the butter, the piece of butter. Sometimes we are churches who want to do ministry, service. Some people would say, oh, you should have thought of the butter, not of the worship. To me, I feel this church coming back again together has to put worship at the center of hope. Because in some way we have become more of churches of socially involved, and that's important, but this should not be the center. We should have Christ as the center. Worship will rebuild us together as churches. And this is where I see working with the pastors, some who get discouraged easily, and some who have the hope because they have a strong spiritual relation and have the centrality of worship in their life and in the life of the church. So this is the first story that I focused about. To be the visible image of God is to be a worshipful church. A church who to know the priority and to put worship